All right, hello everyone, and welcome to the 8th Annual Environmental Justice Symposium. I would like to thank the panelists for joining us and everyone in the audience. Please feel free to get involved in our discussion for today. So for our session, we'll be having a conversation on electrification, electric vehicles, and energy efficiency. So today we'll be talking just a little bit about energy equity and just sharing the burdens and benefits of energy production and consumption, and bringing this to the forefront of environmental justice and energy justice. The panelists today, they were discussing potential solutions of improving electrification and equal access to electric vehicles, and also kind of just talking a little bit about the inequities of the impacts of using these dirty fossil fuels. And just to start with some brief introductions, my name is Brandon Lewis. I'll be the moderator for today's panel. I'm a doctoral student at Yale School of the Environment. My research deals with air pollution and health outcomes. So that includes looking at the production of air pollution from using these dirty fossil fuels and looking at health impacts. So first, I will introduce Dr. Tony Reemes. Dr. Tony Reemes is the Deputy Director of Energy Justice at the U.S. Department of Energy. He leads the department's new Office of Energy Justice Policy and Analysis in the Office of Economic Impacts and Diversity. Dr. Reemes was most recently Professor of Environment and Sustainability at the University of Michigan, where he established the Urban Energy Justice Lab to conduct research and develop solutions on the production and persistence of racial, income, and geographic disparities in the energy economy. So hello, welcome, Dr. Reemes. So next I will introduce Ms. Marilynn-Marsh Robinson. Marilynn-Marsh Robinson is the Senior Manager in Partnerships and Outreach at the Environmental Defense Fund. Marilynn-Marsh Robinson is responsible for collaborating and leading aspects of EDF's zero-emission vehicle transportation strategy, identifying potential partners and nurturing shared dialogue, developing opportunities to leverage common work, and implementing tactical joint efforts and helping develop, guide, and execute organizational priorities to facilitate the deployment of zero emissions in North Carolina. Marilyn serves on the New York Department of Environmental Quality's Environmental Justice and Equity Advisory Board and is a member of the Planning Committee of North Carolina's Environmental Justice Network and has previously served on North Carolina Conservation Network Board. So welcome, Ms. Marsh Robinson. And lastly, Dr. Boris Lukyanov. Dr. Boris Lukyanov joined physicians, scientists, and engineers for Health Energy in 2017 to develop analysis on energy transition pathways that maximize health, equity, and environmental co-benefits. His work focuses on clean energy technologies, energy equity, air quality, energy efficiency, and integrated resource modeling and optimization. Dr. Lukyanov authored peer-reviewed papers and technical policy reports, develops interactive data visualization tools, and serves as an expert on technical advisory committees and regulatory proceedings. So welcome, Dr. Lukyanov. And we'll go ahead and kick off our session with a presentation from Dr. Reemes. And also, if you have any questions, please ask your questions in the chat, and we encourage dialogue just throughout our session.
All right. Thank you so much, Brandon, for the introduction. And I'm excited to be here with my esteemed panelists. I want to thank Dr. Wilson for the invitation to today's conference. So as Brandon mentioned, I'm the Deputy Director for Energy Justice, which is a new title in the Department of Energy. I'm the second person to be in this role following Shalonda Baker, who's currently the director of the Office of Economic Impact and Diversity. So today I want to talk a little bit about our renewed commitment to environmental and energy justice at the Department of Energy, but also as a part of the larger Justice 40 initiative that many of you may have heard of. If I see how I can advance the slides. So it's probably no surprise to anybody on this call that we are living in a national energy and security crisis. Diana Hernandez is known as one of the scholars that has really coined this understanding of energy and security. And we now have national data to really illustrate that this is a problem across the country. And so some of the first national studies on energy and security was a part of the Residential Energy Consumption Survey in 2015, which the Energy Information Administration conducts. And so we saw that kind of three categories of energy and security were prevalent across the country. So about 14% of households were unable to pay their energy bills. 21% of households were foregoing basic food or necessities to pay their energy bills. Many people probably have heard of heat or eat. And then 11% of households were keeping their homes at unhealthy temperatures, either too hot or too cold, because they couldn't afford their energy costs or their equipment was broken. And so you can see over time, those numbers have steadily increased. We saw a slight decrease in the 2020 RECs, which could be a part of when the survey was taken. We know right during the pandemic, many utilities put service disconnection moratoria in place. And so that could explain that. More data needs to be analyzed. But the Census and the Energy Information Administration partnered during the pandemic to really understand the impact of energy and other household issues across the country. And we see that steadily that percentage of households that are suffering from energy insecurity continues to increase. So one metric of energy insecurity is known as energy burden. And I know my colleague Boris will talk about energy burden a little later. But I wanted to show you on this slide that energy burden is not consistent across the country. And it's also not consistent across households of various demographics. And so we can see energy burden as a proportion of the income that people spend on their energy costs differing by region, related to temperature, related to socioeconomic conditions in those places. But we also see racial disparities when it comes to energy burden, with Black households spending 45% more of their income on energy than non-Hispanic white households, and low-income households spending 3.5 times their income on energy costs. And so I've spent the last decade or so really trying to understand this issue of energy burden and racial and socioeconomic disparities. Next slide, please. And so right before joining DOE, some colleagues and I really wanted to understand the relationship between energy burden and public health. And so we did a national study at the county level to look at the relationship between increases in energy burden and three categories of public health. And so what we found was that as each percent of energy burden increased, at the county level, you saw an average of 240 more premature deaths, a 7% increase in the percent of county residents that said their health was fair or poor, and a 5-year decrease in average life expectancy. And so this makes a policy decision or a policy understanding as how energy burden impacts public health and what are the resources that the government can use to actually address this issue. Next slide. And so I just wanted to share this. The slides will be public, but DOE has several tools that look at energy burden and allow you to look at the distribution of energy burden across the country. Next slide. And so what am I doing at DOE? Taking the research that I've done at University of Michigan, the great colleagues that I have across the department that are doing great work on research and development, as well as pilots and deployment. And what is our challenge? So our challenge in our office and our challenge for our colleagues across the federal family is how do we transform our energy system while ensuring that it becomes more equitable and just? Next slide. And so many of you, again, may have heard of the Justice 40 initiative. We view Justice 40 as the framework and pathway to really integrate and advance environmental and energy justice in our energy system. Next slide. And so just for folks who don't know, the Justice 40 initiative was created in the first week of the Biden administration in the president's executive order 14008, tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad. And in section 223, it calls out how certain federal investments might be made toward a goal that 40% of the overall benefits will flow to disadvantaged communities. Next slide. And so how are we implementing this at DOE? We're taking the guidance of the president, as well as the executive office of the president, which includes the Climate Policy Office, the Council on Environmental Quality, and the Office of Management and Budget, given directive to all the agencies, which for us is the Secretary of Energy, and then the Deputy Director for Energy Justice is leading the overall initiative. And so what we did at DOE was we created a Justice 40 team of researchers, scientists, economists, policy advisors, social scientists, talking to stakeholders in the EJ field, in the public health field, in the business and private industry, philanthropy, creating a metrics working group of folks who can think about what are the benefit metrics that we're going to track, what are we already measuring, and then a community of practice, because the goal is that even if this administration is no longer in place, Justice 40 may or may not be a thing because it's an executive order. How do we spread the idea of energy and environmental justice across the department? And so this community of practice represents every program office within the department. Next slide. And so we broke Justice 40 down into 3 buckets to kind of guide our work streams. First, 40% of overall benefits. What do we measure? What do we track? And what are the benefits that will be a part of the programs that are covered by Justice 40? What are the types of investments that we should be looking at? And then how will those investments flow to disadvantaged communities, and where are disadvantaged communities? Next slide. And so just for reference, a covered program, these are our investments that the department makes, fall into these 7 categories, whether it's a climate change program, clean energy, clean transportation, focused on sustainable housing, training and workforce, remediation of pollution, as well as clean water and wastewater infrastructure. And then any type of investment through grants, financing, some staffing, direct financial benefits, and then a catch-all for any other program investment that OMB might determine. Next slide. And so just on July 25th, we had our kind of coming out party for Justice 40 at Department of Energy, where we released all of the programs across our department that will align with and adhere to the Justice 40 principles. And so for DOE, we have 144 programs. We currently have the most programs covered by Justice 40 across the federal government. I'm still waiting on a few agencies to release their programs, but it covers about half of the offices within DOE, 23 program offices. And I shared our website here. You can go to our website and click on a program office and see the programs that fall under Justice 40 and read more about them, access their website so you can learn more. Next slide. And so the second thing we had to do was really define disadvantaged communities. There will be a national tool, federal tool called the Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool that will be released soon. But before that, every agency needed to create their own definition of disadvantaged communities so we could start to track where our investments are going. And so the OMB gave us 2 characteristics for disadvantaged communities. One is a group of individuals that live in geographic proximity. So think about census tracts. And the second one is geographically dispersed individuals that share some common experiences or conditions. And a couple examples are migrant workers or Native Americans. Next slide. And so we did a lot of research. We looked at all the different types of kind of indicators that were out there, what was in the purview of Department of Energy to change. And so our metrics for our disadvantaged communities fell into 4 categories: energy burden, communities that are dependent on the fossil industry, all the known vulnerable sociodemographic characteristics, as well as some environmental and health hazards. So about 36 indicators, equally weighted because we wanted to look at concentrated disadvantage. And then the census tract must have had at least 30% of the households classified as low income. Next slide, please. So we have a tool that identifies about 19% of all U.S. census tracts, because we took the top 20% most disadvantaged communities census tracts in every state. And we also include right now federally recognized tribal lands and U.S. territories in their entirety. And so you can access our tool, our interactive tool here. Next slide. And this is just to show you a quick image of what you could drill down. So this is my hometown in Lee County, South Carolina, which is a disadvantaged community based on our definition. You can drill down into the census tract and see all the characteristics that classify this community as disadvantaged, as well as what those percentages are. Next slide. Now, everyone, and this may come up in the Q&A, like I said, every agency has its own definition right now. So one example of combining definitions is the EV charging Justice 40 map. DOT has a definition, DOE has a definition. We have this joint office of energy and transportation. And so we joined our definitions together to help states identify where they should be making investments in EV infrastructure. Next slide. Again, the CGES will be coming out at some point. Just wanted to show that we have a majority of agreement between our tool and the CGES tool, so about 70% agreement. Next slide. So trying to help people identify what the benefits may be. And so we developed 8 policy priorities, again, really focused on reducing energy burden. Our investments must reduce environmental exposure and burdens. We know that clean energy technology adoption has not been equal across demographic groups, across socioeconomic groups. And so we want to increase parity in clean energy adoption. We want increased access to low-cost capital so communities that are disadvantaged can actually participate in the clean energy transition. We want to create new jobs. We want to create new businesses that are in the space of clean energy and come from or represent disadvantaged communities, and also increasing resilience and democracy. So that means making sure communities can bounce back or make sure communities are resilient in the face of climate change, and also participation and ownership of clean energy assets. Next slide. So this might be a little hard to see, but these are examples of some of the metrics that our programs are starting to collect. What ways are they reducing energy expenditures in disadvantaged communities? What ways are they providing loans to businesses that represent disadvantaged communities, creating new contracts, deploying new technology in communities such as energy storage, as well as how are we engaging stakeholders with events and resources. Next slide. And so to sum up, what we need is a data-driven, place-based approach to energy justice. Because this supports equity, justice, and democracy and is a conduit for community empowerment. It acknowledges that energy decision-making is complex, right? So I'm sorry to my economist friends out there, but we can't describe this through some simple, rational economic models. It takes a lot more of understanding some of the social challenges and social understandings in communities. This approach also fosters social connectedness. It brings people together under the umbrella of energy, but leads to so much more and so many other things that communities can do. And then it increases and creates institutional capabilities for communities to continue on this path of energy transformation. Next slide. And then finally, just a selfish plug. We have a Justice 40 webinar, so you can learn a lot more about what our programs are doing, hear from the Secretary and Director Baker, as well as how the infrastructure law is incorporating Justice 40, and then some of our programs. And so hopefully many of you can join us on August 17th. Next slide. And that's it. Thank you so much. I look forward to the conversation.
All right, and thank you for that great presentation. I think it's very important while making sure that we have an equitable transition to clean energy. Like you said, it's important to have this data and before we can do anything, to quantify and measure what we see with with our energy burden. So next we have Miss Marilynn-Marsh Robinson.
Great. Thank you, Brandon. Tony is definitely a tough act to follow, but I thank you for the opportunity. Thank you, Dr. Wilson and the center. It's great to be with you all, to be with this great panel, and everyone for being here. I would like to tell you a little bit about Environmental Defense Fund first. People may not know the organization, but we are a global environmental advocacy organization that has been in existence for about 50 years. We work in several programs: climate, energy, ecosystems, health, and we have a multidisciplinary approach where we work with science, economics, partnerships, and advocacy. And I've been asked to discuss how we advance zero emission truck and bus efforts through our partnership work. So, why do we focus on transportation? Well, transportation is the largest emitting sector, as you can see by the graph. Um, it is larger than the electric sector. And relative to population size, trucks and buses are responsible for a disproportionate amount of climate change and health impact and pollution. So, according to NESCOM, which is Northeast States for Coordinated Air Use Management, um, medium heavy duty, which is what we primarily focus on, they only account for 5% of the vehicles on the road, but they account for 30% of the greenhouse gas emissions, 42% of the smog forming NOx emissions, which is a precursor to ground level ozone, and 51% of PM 2.5. And so it's very important to focus on transportation, and in our opinion, very important to focus on medium heavy duty. In Maryland, medium heavy duty trucks and buses make up about 9% of the state's registered vehicles, but they contribute about 39% of nitrogen oxide and about 48% of PM 2.5, and about a little over 20% of global warming emissions of all the vehicles on the road. And that's from Union of Concerned Scientists. And here are some more facts about transportation and health impacts. As you can see, the first bullet here talks about the premature deaths from motor vehicle pollution on our and that millions more suffer from respiratory illnesses, lost work days, and lost school days. We also know that warehouses and distribution centers are often concentrated in low income communities and communities of color, and that as a result, air pollution, including emissions from diesel trucks, are disproportionately concentrated in these neighborhoods. And so that's going to also exacerbate people that may already have illnesses such as asthma, chronic heart disease, stroke, and other illnesses. and just also want to stress too that as you know, as we move to this e-commerce society, demands will increase, and so as we and not to pick on Amazon, but and even I'm guilty of it of ordering things, but as we begin to order things more and have them delivered, we're going to see more trucks on the road, and so we have to think about how just how our everyday behavior plays into this dynamic. And so just want to talk a bit about how we are advancing zero emission vehicles through our partnership work, and that we are working with our health team on mapping tools and deepening our relationships with impacted communities, and also working with the business community. So the first thing that I want to highlight is our proximity mapping tool. So using publicly available information, EDF mapped warehouses and distribution centers, which attract large amounts of traffic, diesel truck traffic. We layered that information with demographic and health data in the communities located within a half mile of the warehouses. And so we layered that information with race, income, social vulnerability, health indicators such as COPD, asthma, heart disease, and stroke, and created some maps. And so as you can see here, if you look at this map of Baltimore County and city, you can see the percentages of people of color, the green dots representing some of the warehouses, and then we've also added where EPA air monitors are located. And that information can be used in a number of ways. And we're trying to partner with communities to show this type of information. We realize that, oftentimes you would see a group, normally you would see a group like EDF maybe publish a report or publishes information. But we realize that, that's not the best. We're not the best messengers for this information. We're kind of the usual suspects, right? People would expect us to kind of raise the alarm, but it's best to work with communities, the impacted communities, and first ground truth the data, right, and see how they feel about the maps. Is this something that's useful in their advocacy? We also realize that the warehouse data set is limited, so there could be additional information that they know about their communities, right, that should be considered. Nobody knows that community like the people that live there, and so realize that being in working with the people that are on the ground, the people that are closest to the problem are always closest to the solution, right? And so that is something that we're trying to do, is work with communities to see if this information is indeed helpful. How can it be helpful in their advocacy? Also, they are the ones that can hold their elected officials accountable. So how can this be helpful in their, advocating at the local level, state, and federal level, right? When you look at the air monitoring, there could be some other places in need. Looks like there could be some places in need of monitoring. And so that could be some additional places for outreach, where groups may want to engage in outreach, education, as they organize. There also may be places where people want to engage in citizen science, right? We know that at the center, Dr. Wilson has helped put community monitoring networks together. We've worked with communities on that as supported those types of efforts as well. And so this maybe could be helpful in identifying where those types of efforts could be helpful, and that could be helpful in bringing attention to some things going on in that community, right? And so while it may not um, provide the level of data like an EPA monitor, it can definitely provide some data, and the community can take that along with things like truck counts and other things and say this is what's going on in our community. And so it gives some power. It empowers the community. So again, how can these mapping tools and how can these outputs be helpful with the community? And just realizing that, for groups like ours, it's important for us to step back, not be in front, and be in a supportive role, right? Here's another output from that type of mapping. Just looking at demographics from around the warehouse. And if you look at the minority percentage, the Black percentage, and poverty percentage in those populations, they are all higher than the state averages. And so that's another data point that could definitely be helpful. And working with a group in Chicago, what they said would be helpful for them is as they talk with their elected officials, understanding more about health cost avoided is something they felt like would be that would be moving to their elected officials. And so we were able to pull some of those costs together. But, they felt like the money would be something that would resonate. And so again, working with that community that's on the ground, working with that group that's on the ground, informed an output that was best for them in their advocacy. So again, it's not about what we think. It's about working with that group on the ground and letting that drive advocacy efforts. So we're learning, y'all. Another effort that I wanted to highlight is our work with the Port of Houston. We're helping to convene what's called the Houston Industry and Community Zero Emissions Drayage Work Group. And it is comprised of environmental justice advocates, community-based organizations, fleet owners, and others that are working together at all levels to secure resources to protect the communities from drayage, truck pollution, noise, and also look at community standards that are, that the and concerns being raised by the community. So the work group brings together industries, leaders like Walmart, IKEA, and also community partners like Public Citizen, also some of the community-based groups, to come up with solutions to make the Port of Houston cleaner and safer. So looking at solutions like anti-idling ordinances, deploying ZEV trucks and yard tractors, looking at charging infrastructure, and also looking at routes. What's the best route to go through in communities. Together, the work group has helped advance a successful grant application that included $15 million for an anti-idling campaign. And we feel also that the work group was important and very supportive to the 2050 carbon neutral goal that the Port of Houston has implemented. So just wanted to raise that. wanted to also just bring up the Fleet Solutions Center. That's a resource that offers medium and heavy duty fleet owners kind of with the one-stop shop for resources. And this is something that that is new that we've been working on, but we partner with industry leaders, NGOs to kind of share best practices needed to navigate fleet electrification. And one thing that we are thinking about with that is how equity and should be embedded into that as well. And we're looking at trying to do that. And so just wanted to, you know, I think I'm coming up on time, but just, want to thank you for the time. If you're interested to know about, if you're interested in any of the projects that I've mentioned, please contact me. I can connect you with the people that are working on those. But also just to say that, EDF, Environmental Defense Fund, is, we are a larger organization that's learning, that's learning and learning about more about equity and working with communities. The green movement has traditionally not been as inclusive as Dr. Wilson and I talk about a lot, but we are on an equity journey, and we're learning and we're trying to be more meaningful in our engagement and be more thoughtful and think about how to leverage our positions, our resources, and how to be better partners and allies. And so, thank you for your time, and I yield the rest of my time.
All right. Thank you, Ms. Marsh Robinson, for that great presentation. I feel like it's definitely important to know how to utilize our resources efficiently, and also very important to, while working with these communities, not only for advocacy, but for sustainability. So after kind of our budgets come and go, groups move in, move out, administration moves in and moves out. We would like for these communities to have the tools to be able to keep pushing for equity in the communities. All right, next we have Dr. Lukanov.
Thank you, Brendan, and thank you so much for the invitation and for the opportunity to present here on such an important topic and as part of such a great panel. So the title of my talk today is Alleviating Energy Cost Burden Disparities, How Investments in Low-Income Residential Energy Efficiency and Electrification Can Help Narrow the Energy Equity Divide. And I'd like to start with a brief introduction of our organization, PSC Healthy Energy. We're a nonprofit energy science and energy policy research institute based in Oakland, California. We study the way energy production and use impact public health, equity, and the environment. And our main mission is to bring rigorous, trustworthy science into energy policy conversations at all levels of decision-making, federal, state, and local. And today I will talk about a recent study that we conducted titled Pathways to Energy Affordability in Colorado, pictured here on the right. The study was commissioned by the Colorado Energy Office, and as part of it, we were asked to characterize energy burdens across the state and across various demographic groups, all at very granular spatial scales. We were also asked to propose and evaluate different strategies for eliminating energy burden disparities in the state and in the context of Colorado's clean energy transition goals. These kinds of analyses are critically needed. 1 in 3 US households, around 40 million in total, according to the EIA, are facing the persistent and fundamental challenge of having troubles paying their energy bills, of energy insecurity, while also having to pay for the other essential services like food and medicine and rent. So an urgent question posed by climate imperatives is whether the clean energy transition can be managed in a way that increases energy affordability and eliminates energy burden inequities. And the answer is a resounding yes, and I'll try to show that to you in the next slides. I'll start with how we go about analyzing energy cost burden disparities and what metrics we think matter the most and why. And then I'll show some key results from our Colorado study and discuss some of our key strategies to alleviate residential energy burden disparities in the state. As part of our study, we were asked to review existing analyses and metrics related to energy cost burden. We looked at a variety of energy affordability metrics, of which there are many, so I won't go through all of them in the interest of time. But the one most commonly used in the literature, and the one Tony mentioned, and the one we adopted is so-called absolute energy cost burden, defined very simply as the share of household income spent on utility bills. Most studies use 6% of income as a threshold for high energy burden, and so did we. However, this metric alone often fails to capture additional factors that can influence energy burden besides income and fuel costs, of course. Variables like home size and home efficiency, for example. That's why we also looked at energy use intensity, defined simply as the home energy consumption per square foot, which accounts for the effect of home size and can serve as a proxy for energy efficiency. One important thing here is that neither of these metrics are normally looked at on very granular spatial scales, such as census tract level, and especially not for entire states. But that turns out to be essential for identifying demographic groups in specific areas that struggle the most to pay their energy bills, and to also be able to develop policies and programs tailored specifically to meet the needs of these demographic groups in geographic areas. The problem is that residential energy use data are not available on such fine spatial scales, such as census tracts. And what this means is that modeling and interpolation are needed to calculate energy affordability on the census tract level, and then to analyze it alongside demographic data available through the Census Bureau. So to get this kind of spatial granularity, we generated census tract level estimates for residential energy use by fuel type and by end use by developing a regression model based on various geographic, demographic, climate, and housing characteristics. We used both the residential energy consumption survey data and Census Bureau demographic data. And this combination allowed us to map energy cost burdens and energy use intensity by census tract across the state. We're also able to estimate energy use at the household level through additional modeling, which hasn't been done before, and which it turns out is essential in estimating the number of households within different income brackets that struggle to pay their energy bills. And it's also essential for being able to recommend programs and policies tailored to meet their specific needs. So let's take a look at some of our findings next. This slide shows a map of average energy cost burdens in Colorado by census tract as a percent of median household income. Blue color here indicates lower energy burdens, orange higher, and the color transition point is set at 6% of median household income. So we see that energy cost burdens are distributed very unevenly across the state. In general, we find that rural areas in Colorado experience higher energy burdens, especially areas where propane is commonly used as a heating fuel, and also in some of the more severe climate zones that require more heating or cooling. This means that low-income electrification of heating, along with building weatherization, would be top priority in such areas. It's important to remember that individual households, even in census tracts colored in blue here, may actually face higher energy cost burdens, higher individual cost burdens than 6%, which is why model estimates at the household level are so important to get a more accurate picture. Overall, we found that about 17% of households in Colorado face high energy burdens above the 6% threshold. Energy affordability is a particularly acute problem for low-income households. This plot shows average energy cost burdens by census tract as a function of the census tract's median household income. Energy burden is by definition dependent on income, However, the relationship is very nonlinear, as you can see in the figure. So low-income census tracts tend to experience dramatically higher energy cost burdens. Overall, we found that energy cost burdens are especially high for the state's rural communities, mobile homes, households heated by propane, as I said. So again, low-income electrification and weatherization programs would be a huge priority in such areas. In addition, we looked at energy cost burden disparities in urban areas across various demographic groups. The top figure on the right here shows the average energy cost burdens colored by fuel type here. It shows that they increase for census tracts with a higher share of renters. This is despite the fact that average fuel consumption by census tracts, shown on the top left, actually decreases in census tracts with higher fraction of renter population. The same is true in census tracts with higher share of Latino and Black populations, which tend to have high energy burdens, while the opposite is true in census tracts with higher share of white populations, which tend to have lower energy burdens. So in general, we found that urban census tracts with a higher share of renters, higher share of people of color, lower average education levels, they tend to experience substantially higher energy burdens. And this is true even when controlling for income, which, as we know, is well correlated with these variables. So next, I'll talk a bit about some of our proposed solutions and policy recommendations. Our goal was to design a strategy that would be fully consistent with Colorado's emission reduction targets while bringing energy costs to under 6% of income for all low-income households in the state and over a 20-year period. To do this, we prioritize greenhouse gas emission reduction strategies that simultaneously reduce energy cost burdens, such as efficiency, weatherization, community solar, and electrification. Our 6 core strategies included expanding enrollment in bill assistance programs, such as percent of income payment plans, but only in the near term. Greatly expanding weatherization grants for the lowest income households with incomes below the federal poverty limit, and providing low to no interest loans for the rest. 3, expanding community solar to supply discounted electricity for the most energy burdened urban communities that we identified. 4 is electrifying heating and cooking, thereby decreasing overall energy use and most bills, although also increasing electricity demand as fossil fuel use goes down. So that necessitates grid upgrades to ensure reliability. 5 is expanding demand response for additional economic opportunities for LMI households. And finally, reducing bill assistance over time as clean energy investments start to effectively reduce residential energy burdens. Now, I want to make an important side note here about residential building electrification. In a different set of studies over a year ago, we analyzed in detail several deep decarbonization scenarios for 3 Western states, Colorado, Nevada, and New Mexico. The scenarios and results were developed by Evolved Energy, while we at PSC analyzed their health and equity impacts. The scenarios include an optimal case with a mix of achievable decarbonization goals for all sectors by 2050, a slow electricity scenario allowing for residual emissions from coal plants that haven't retired by 2030, a low demand scenario that focused more on the demand side reductions of energy use, and a 100% renewable scenario that focused on the full transition to renewables in all sectors by 2050. This graph shows our calculated evolution of average residential energy bills under these different scenarios for both adopters of efficiency and electrification, colored in blue here, and for non-adopters, colored in red. And we see that unless mitigation strategies are taken, all 4 decarbonization scenarios result in skyrocketing utility bills after 2035 for households that do not electrify their appliances and continue to use natural gas. And this is because fewer and fewer customers will be paying for the upkeep of aging gas infrastructure. And this means that unless low-income and frontline communities are among the first to electrify before 2035, we actually risk exacerbating energy burden disparities. Back to our Colorado report. So again, our strategies include low-income efficiency and weatherization with grants to the lowest-income households and loans gradually replacing grants at the higher income levels, building out community solar to provide discounted electricity, and guaranteeing it with the loan loss reserves by a green bank, low-income electrification and demand response. And the figure here shows the cumulative impact of these interventions on households in Colorado within 3 different income brackets. Below the federal poverty level on the left, 100 to 150% of federal poverty level in the middle, and 150 to 200% of the federal poverty level on the right. The height of the bars here indicates the number of households within each of these income brackets, and the colors indicate the number of households within the different energy cost burden levels. The ones colored in orange being above 6%. The leftmost bars in each income bracket show the status quo in 2019. We then apply sequentially efficiency measures, then efficiency plus community solar, then adding electrification and demand response, thus showing the sequential impact of these various investments on reducing energy burdens. And after 20 years, the end result is that after these sequential interventions, essentially all households within the 2 higher income brackets would have energy cost burdens that are affordable, and only a small number of households in the lowest income bracket would still need some form of bill assistance. This is all while also reducing residential carbon emissions and helping meet the state's climate goals compared to, say, a bill assistance only approach. Importantly, we also found that aligning climate and affordability goals and prioritizing investments in energy burden populations can help states meet their greenhouse gas emission reduction targets while also saving billions of dollars. This figure shows the annual amount of funding needed for our preferred approach in millions of dollars over a 20-year period, with the bill assistance portion shaded in gray, the grants portion shaded in yellow. Funding for loans is also shown with the blue dotted line. And all of these are compared to a bill assistance only approach, which is shown by the black dashed line, assuming no investment in low-income efficiency and electrification. And so we find that fully integrating equity considerations with climate change mitigation goals in Colorado results in cumulative savings of over $1.5 billion over a 20-year period compared to a bill assistance only approach, even though the initial upfront costs are higher, as you can see in the earlier years portion of the graph. And the reason for these overall savings is that investments in energy upgrades in energy cost burden communities actually lower the total amount of direct assistance needed to make utility bills affordable for these households over this time period. And also in part because low-income households generally live in less efficient homes, and weatherization investments have a greater potential for higher return over time in these homes. So to summarize, prioritizing decarbonization strategies based on their ability to simultaneously reduce energy burden disparities can save states billions of dollars. This approach is in stark contrast to the conventional approach, which puts energy bill assistance and climate investments sort of on separate tracks. And achieving these overall savings requires giving first priority to low-income households for energy efficiency and fuel switching programs, instead of waiting for the cost of clean energy technologies to decline, for example. This is not only a more just approach, it also saves money for the states to invest in cost burden households from the get-go. And also, we should recognize that all homes must reach increased levels of energy efficiency and electrification over the next 20, 30 years anyway. So we find that it's key to start with actually the low-income communities and disadvantaged communities. In practice, this would mean policies like grants and low-interest loans, incentives for utilities and landlords, green bank funded loss reserves to enable low-income and frontline communities to participate, and many other considerations that we outline in the report. And we've also begun a push to incorporate these kinds of analysis into utility integrated resource plans. Utility companies have access to very detailed energy use data at the customer level that can be aggregated and used to evaluate the landscape of energy burdens across the utility service territory in a way that is probably going to be more accurate and more detailed than what we did. And the goal here should be to incorporate energy burden analysis into the IRP process in a way that meaningfully reduces energy burden disparities over time. And that's certainly something that utilities can be asked for. Integrating health and equity analysis in climate policy and IRP processes is still a relatively new thing, but our analysis shows that it supports greater social justice, achieves greater emission reductions, and also makes economic sense for state budgets and for society as a whole. And also, these benefits can garner additional support for clean energy policies. And that's all I had. Thank you so much. Looking forward to the conversation.
All right, thank you, Dr. Lucanau, for the great presentation. I'm highlighting the synergies between climate and greenhouse gas reduction and just energy affordability and efficiency. And so now we're heading into the Q&A portion of our session. So if anyone has any questions, please drop them in the comment box. And also I have questions of my own, which are the benefits of being a moderator. So I guess first we'll start with the questions in the comments, if that's okay. Let's see. Looks like we have one question for Dr. Boris. And this is from James Wagner. So do you know how much land area is needed for a community solar garden? He said, my concern is that in urban settings, there isn't enough open space to make such an installation worth it.
Thanks for that question. It's a good question. I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but there are lots of possibilities for community solar outside of open areas. There, for example, could be warehouse roofs or areas that are cited for remediation, brownfields, etc., that are prime candidates for community solar. And actually, just off the top of my head, to cover the needs for the lowest income households, the amount of electricity is actually not going to be that huge. And so I think it's an important consideration, but I also think it's actually not a real issue when it comes to community solar and directing electricity from community solar to those communities that are a relatively small fraction of the overall population.
All right. Thank you. And so I have, let me see if there are any more questions in the chat. Okay, I have a few questions of my own. I'm excited to answer. This is for Dr. Reems. And also anyone can provide input for this question. So I assume there are a lot of factors that can explain, energy burden and insecurity. But I assume there's like kind of a temporal aspect of maybe when energy burdens and insecurity spike. Some things that come to mind is like maybe extreme weather events or even just the ebbs and flows of our economic health. So is there any way we can kind of predict where we see these spikes of energy insecurity, and have you taken a look at it in your office?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Brandon. Energy insecurity broadly is very nuanced, right? And I think Boris got at that a little bit, and you can look at some of the research that's happening out in the energy field to look at all these variables that contribute to energy insecurity or energy poverty or energy burden. So that's another ongoing debate in the field about the terminology that we use, and they all have kind of different definitions. Starting with fuel poverty in the UK in the 80s. So at the core of the kind of cost structure is this proportion of income, right? And so that it's abstract of the temporal issues that you bring up, as well as all the other contributing factors. Energy insecurity goes to make that connection with public health, but also look at these different conditions that people are living in. And so temperatures inside your home, what contributes to that, whether it's the equipment is broken, whether it's because you have multiple fuels, so electricity or some type of natural gas or fuel oil. There's also, the idea of the kind of behavioral aspect where people are making these tough choices between using energy to their full capacity or trading off for other costs. And then there's just the kind of brass tacks of getting a shutoff notice and actually being disconnected. And so across that spectrum, so many things are happening that contribute to the inability to use energy to its full capacity. What we're seeing now as we are moving into warmer temperatures is the growth of something like air conditioning, which can contribute to increased energy burdens, right? Because people, may not have been using energy to cool their homes in the summertime, particularly where I was in Michigan. We did a study, and 80% of the households in Detroit that we studied did not have AC because there was a time when you could just open your window in the summer and that would cool your home. So now what does that do for someone on a fixed income? When now they're using either a window unit that, if it's not brand new, it's probably inefficient. And so you see now a lot of definitions that are trying to account for that. There was a really good study by Destiny Knock and her colleagues looking at, the temperature where people would turn their AC on in the Southwest. And you saw in areas where people had lower incomes, there was more time and a higher indoor temperature or higher outside temperature before people would turn their ACs on. And one of your colleagues at Yale, Gabriel Gadsden, and I, we did a study 2 years ago now, looking at winter temperatures in low-income households. And we found that elderly households, people with lower incomes, were actually keeping the indoor temperatures a lot cooler than was recommended by the World Health Organization. And so I think understanding this and the nuance, as well as the type of equipment that people have in their homes, will help us understand that better. And then to wrap up, the Weatherization Assistance Program, which is one of the essential programs for the Department of Energy, has a lot of new projects that was part of their Enhancement and Innovation Prize or funding opportunity. And some of the grantees are starting to look at understanding this issue a lot more. So we're doing the work, and it takes a lot of work to really understand that and gets at kind of understanding it at a more granular scale.
All right, great. And you hit on a lot of interesting things that kind of just looking at energy, energy insecurity is has multi-factors to it. And it's very important to not get lost in the factors, because we know there's many factors, but to highlight the most important factors and kind of hone in on that. And I think this topic is definitely becoming more important, not only as obviously like climate change, and we expect more extreme weather events, more extreme cold events and hot events, but also, just looking at the economic health. I know we've seen kind of in the past year, like oil and gas prices have risen, and so that'll be impacting, energy insecurity. So this is definitely important. So we have another question in the chat, and this can be for everyone. So because so many low-income households are renters, how do we ensure that grants go to landlords for energy efficiency are actually passed on to tenants in terms of savings? And that's a very great question. Let's see, I guess we can start with you, Ms. Marsh Robinson. Do you have any commentary on that?
I don't have any comments on that right now, because I've my presentation was about ZEVs, but yeah, I guess I would have to pass right now. Yeah.
Yeah, if you have any commentary on that, Dr. Reems, I know your presentation kind of talked about just participation and ownership of clean energy. I don't know if you have any thoughts.
I'll mention briefly from the federal perspective, and Boris might have some more at the state and local level. Within a program like the Weatherization program, about 80% of those dollars go to homeowners. And so the program is more focused on homeowners, but landlords can actually participate, particularly if their tenants are low income and would qualify for the Weatherization Assistance Program on their own. And so you have to put customer protections in place. And so a lot of government programs that go to landlords have requirements in that you can't raise the rent for 2 to 3 years, or you can't, use the government funds and then put the tenant out. And so having those customer protections in place is really key and is part of how a lot of these programs operate. You see the same thing in like lead programs that public health departments use. It's usually a 2 to 3 year protection for the tenants that live in the home.
I can add a couple of words to what Tony said. Yeah, I mean, this is a classic problem. It's known as the split incentive, and the problem is that tenants often are not responsible for the upgrades of their appliances, and landlords don't have an incentive to upgrade them because they don't have to pay the bills. And so yeah, I mean, specific incentives are needed for these kinds of upgrades for landlords specifically, so that they're incentivized to upgrade their appliances. And in addition to that, what Tony said, definitely you have to have some protections for tenants in place, so that this doesn't result in their bills actually going up. And also, these kinds of upgrades for tenants, we think should be coupled with opportunities for tenants to participate in demand response programs. So with upgrading these appliances, that's an additional sort of revenue stream, potential revenue stream to for tenants to lower their energy bills. Yeah.
All right, thank you for your thoughts, Dr. Luganov. So I have one question. So how has the EDF's zero emission vehicle transportation strategy accounted for the impacts of traffic-related air pollution by communities of color? And what additional measures do you think can be implemented to alleviate this burden? And this is for Ms. Marsh Robinson.
Thank you for the question. I think we so there's a goal of 100% zero emission truck and bus sales by 2035, especially in pollution burdened communities. And I think we can, continue to push for that. Reports show that technology is increasing, and that the total cost of ownership is becoming more favorable compared to diesel vehicles for most vehicle types. And so really pushing for cleaner vehicles is, is imperative for the health of our communities and the climate. I think continuing to use mapping tools to and other resources to drive where those investments go. As it was said earlier about energy efficiency, and from my presentation earlier, the people that are overburdened and feeling these impacts the most, I mean, they should be prioritized for these investments. And so being able to help make that case and using resources to do that. And then finally, I can't say enough about, and Dr. Wilson and I come from the same environmental justice network in North Carolina, where we got a lot of our mentoring and training from. Just, EDF is on this equity journey and deepening our relationships with communities and learning from communities. And we must continue that work. This is not just a moment. This is something that our organization is committed to. And it makes us a better and a stronger organization. So I think, continuing to do those three things helps respond to that.
All right, thank you. And I kind of want to continue this conversation. I want to ask another question. So kind of in your presentation, you mentioned, communities that live, near these truck and distribution centers. But I kind of want to bring up a question for the community of truckers. So how do they feel about, this transition, and what are the conversations you having with them? Are they supporting this? So I kind of want your thoughts on that.
We are having conversations with fleet. So there's the fleet owners, and then there's the truckers, right? My brother is a trucker, but he's not the fleet a fleet owner or a company, right? And so I think that you have some fleet owners that are making commitments already, right, because of their sustainability and interest in the climate. And I think you will see and have seen, like I said, some larger companies make those commitments. But then we also have to make sure that smaller companies and independent truckers, as you talked about truckers, they can transition to this, that this is an equitable transition or small business owners, right? We just don't want to see kind of the large fleets transition and then have other people left out. And so our conversations have mostly been with larger fleet owners, because that's where our relationships have been. But we've been having conversations with smaller companies and thinking about how to engage independent truckers as well, because that's part of equity, right? That's part of equity, thinking about different business models and how everyone transitions. And like I said, I have a brother that's an independent trucker, and we're constantly talking about this. And there are concerns about what about the infrastructure, what about technology and things like that, and what this will mean for different people. But the key is to keep keep dialogue open, and to and for groups like ours to make sure that we are having conversations with a diverse group of stakeholders, and not just the large companies, because it's going to mean, because people have different resources, right? So it's going to mean different things for everybody. So thank you so much for that. The the uh the independent truckers, small companies, they're often left out of the equation. And so, like I said, my brother is a trucker, so I appreciate the question personally.
All right, thank you. I have a question for Dr. Luganov. So, kind of in your presentation, you mentioned just the availability of the energy use data and just the scale it's available on. It's not available on smaller spatial scales. And so kind of just going with that thought process, is this data coming from utility companies, and do they have an incentive to kind of release or create data at smaller scales, and what are the benefits of having this data at that level?
That's a great question. I mean, as a data sort of science institute and energy institute, for us, the more data available, the better, and we think that's actually better for the policy process as well, because the better data we have and the better science we have, the more we can inform the policy conversations. We are the place right now where we can actually simulate, as I mentioned in my presentation, and estimate energy use at the household level. We're testing these results right now. They seem pretty accurate. We're testing and comparing with other researchers like Fisher, Sheehan, and Colton data. And we think that we're the place where we can produce some very reliable estimates on that front. That said, census tract level data is also sufficient to do very sophisticated demographic analysis and inform policy conversations. And that data that can be done more easily using just residential energy consumption survey data and Census Bureau data on the census tract level. Again, it still requires some sophisticated modeling to get these data. As for your question about utility service territories, so yeah, they have customer level data, right? There are obviously privacy issues that they need to be concerned about, and they are justifiably so. But that data can be aggregated on census tract level or even smaller units without affecting without privacy concerns, say on the census block level, and very accurate analysis can be done with this kind of actual real world data. And I think that that is something that can be asked of utility companies to do with the help of organizations like ours or others, to do these kinds of analysis and actually commit to meaningful energy burden disparity reductions over time as part of the RFP processes, as I mentioned. So that's definitely something that we will keep pushing for. We think that's very important, and we think that's very, very doable.
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Luganov. So we're approaching the end of our session. I would like to give a chance for each panelist to give closing remarks about what we need to do, where do we go from here when we're talking about energy equity. And we're going to start with Dr. Reems.
All right. Thank you again, Brandon, for a great panel. And to my panelists, thank you. We know that Black, Brown, Indigenous, low-income, fossil energy communities have borne the burden of our energy system, over the last, several decades. We're in a moment of transition. I like to call it a transformation. And if we do the same things that we've done in the past, those communities will continue to suffer and bear the brunt of the energy system and not reap the benefits. And so we are at a critical moment in our country where we need to shift. We need to shift the paradigm where low-income communities, communities of color, fossil energy communities are actually in the driving seat or seen as partners in this energy transition. And that's the only way to real, true energy justice and energy equity. So thank you again, and look forward to working with everybody in that vein.
All right, thank you, Ms. Marsh Robinson.
Thank you so much, Brandon, and thanks to Dr. Wilson and the center again for having me on the panel. I mean, Dr. Reems, you said exactly what I was gonna say. There is no one silver bullet to electrification or energy equity or any of these issues. It's going to take a fulsome suite of policies, and it's going to take diverse voices at the table, and it's definitely going to take us doing things in a different way. But one thing that we know for certain, that these communities that are disproportionately impacted, that are overburdened, that are closest to the problem, they have to be at the center of the solution. And it's past time that we, have these conversations and make sure that we are incorporating them and going to them and being intentional about the actions that we do. And I'm glad to be a part of an organization that is doing that and is seeking out genuine and authentic relationships. And I think this is a wonderful time for this movement, and I'm just happy to be here, and I'm excited about what we're going to do.
All right, thank you. And Dr. Lukanov?
I want to extend thank you again for inviting me to be part of this panel, and it's been great to present along these panelists. And I've cited Dr. Reems on several of our recent reports many times, so it's really great to be here. And I want to just reemphasize the important point that giving first priority to low-income households for energy efficiency and fuel switching programs, instead of waiting for example, for the cost of these technologies to decline because low-income programs are more expensive, is not the right approach according to our research. And prioritizing these communities is not only the more just approach, it also seems to save money, save states money to invest in these energy burden households from the get-go. And then I also want to reemphasize the fact that all homes will need to reach increased levels of energy efficiency and electrification over the next 20, 30 years anyway. And so it really makes a lot of sense to focus a larger amount of resources on these frontier communities and disadvantaged communities in order to actually achieve a more just world and achieve an economic savings in the process.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Luganov. First, I'd like to thank our amazing panelists for a great discussion and great presentations. Thank everyone in the audience for joining us, watching, and participating. Thank the CEE, JH staff and administrators. And if you have any questions for our panelists, you can get their information on the website. Also, any questions for me as well. So we'll take a 30-minute lunch break, and we'll start back with our next group of sessions at 1 p.m. And I hope everyone will continue to enjoy the symposium and have a great day. Thank you.